Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
Desperation, I think, is the emotion that, I don't know if desperation is an emotion, but the feeling that motivated them. And I think that's the case with anybody. And I think, honestly, we're seeing that now. There's a lot of desperate people in the world right now. And sometimes it causes you to make really dumb decisions when you're desperate, but other times it could give you real clarity. And I think in the case of the people I wrote about, it was the latter.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 75, where we're 3/4 of the way there. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or have authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Jared Diamond about his book, Swing Kings. Jared Diamond has been the national baseball writer for the Wall Street Journal since 2017. Prior to that, he spent a season as the Journal's Yankees beat writer and 3 seasons as their Mets beat writer. In his current role, he leads the newspaper's baseball coverage. This is his first book. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. All right, everyone, and hello and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. It is May already, believe it or not. I am your host, John Monaster. Very excited to be here today with national baseball writer for the Wall Street Journal, Jared Diamond. Jared, say hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hello. Real excited to talk about Jared's new book, Swing Kids, all about baseball for those of you that have been missing it. And we're going to dive real deep into it. But Jared, just kind of kick us off. Tell us what the book is all about.
Well, this book is, on the broad level, it's about a change in baseball, a revolution in how baseball is being played as it pertains to hitting and the swing. Anyone that followed baseball knows that last season set an all-time record for home runs in a season across the major leagues. That was a record that was previously set just in 2017. So home runs are on the rise in ways we've never seen before. It's an unprecedented power surge, even compared to sort of the mid-2000s or late 90s, which we all know as the steroid era. We think of that as the biggest home run time in baseball. But what we're seeing now even surpasses that. And what the book explores is why that's happening. Specifically, changes to the way the swing itself is being taught to major league hitters. That goes against a century of conventional wisdom. And not only is it changing, the origin of the change was a very interesting group of people, the ultimate baseball outsiders who have led the charge of this incredible revolution that's changed baseball forever.
Yeah. And become the ultimate baseball insiders in a way.
Exactly. It's so funny. I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but so many of the people in my book, when I started working on the book just about 2 years ago, were on the complete fringes of the industry, and now they're not anymore. Not to spoil it too much, but suffice it to say, a lot changed with these people in the 18, 20 months I was working on this.
Yeah. Well, I just like to get a couple personal kind of things out before we really hop into it. So, I know this is kind of your beat, so, obviously this is what you're into, but really, why did you decide to write about this particular issue in baseball? Why was this so important to put into book form?
It has fascinated me since 2013, which is the first year I was covering baseball. I was covering the Mets. I was the full-time Mets beat writer for the Wall Street Journal my first season. And the Mets that year, in the offseason between 12 and 13, signed a player named Marlon Byrd to a minor league contract. Now, Marlon Byrd was 35 years old. He'd been in the major leagues for over a decade. He was coming off a steroid suspension. Him signing with the Mets was completely insignificant. In fact, I did not even write about it in the Journal when the Mets signed him. It was that minor of a transaction. Well, lo and behold, not only does Marlon Byrd make the team out of spring training, he ends up by the early May was their cleanup hitter, and he wound up being their best player that season. And all year long, I would ask him, what is going on? Like, how are you doing that? How are you so good? Because I've seen you for 12 years. You were not this good before. Now you're old. So what's going on? He really wouldn't say. He was very coy about it. Finally, at the end of the year, the Mets had traded him to the Pirates. Finally, he sort of lets out his secret, which is he had spent the entire offseason remaking his swing from scratch with a guy named Doug Latta, who is a former swimming pool repairman who happened to own a batting cage in Southern California, never played baseball above low-level college. And according to this major league veteran, this is the person who taught him more about hitting than anyone he had ever met, including major league hitting coaches. Well, that just blew my mind. I couldn't understand how that was possible. This question kind of haunted me, which is, if there are better hitting coaches than major league hitting coaches, why are they not the major league hitting coaches? Right. And I think any good book sort of starts with a question like that. There's a question that you just have to answer. At first, I thought, well, maybe this is a weird fluke, a weird one-off. I very quickly learned it wasn't. The very next season, there was a couple more players who had similar stories having incredible turnarounds. And every year from 13, 14, 15, 16, even into 17, there'd be more stories about great players or previously not so great players who became great, who had a similar story, going to work with some hitting instructor who never played baseball himself and doesn't work in pro ball. And I kind of realized, okay, this is not just one guy's story. This is a incredible movement that's changing the game. And that's when it became a book. It started as a story in the Wall Street Journal. It ran in the Wall Street Journal in March of 2017, where I first sort of explored this topic. And after I wrote that, 1,000 words, I still had so much more I wanted to say.
Yeah. That's a good sign when you got a book there ahead of you. So taking that 1,000 words, then how did you turn it into the book? You clearly did a ton of research here. I mean, you crisscrossed the country, you talked to different people, you participated in some of these workouts, you worked with these gurus. How did you actually turn that into the book? Did you have a process, or was this your first book? I mean, how did you make that happen? I had never written a book before, so I had absolutely no idea what I was doing when I started. And it's really funny about that. So I sold the book in January of 2018. I go to spring training in February, the way I normally would for the Journal, but I have a different mission this year. In addition to my normal work, I'm also trying to do a ton of reporting for the book, because spring training is just a great time to get to talk to people at length. It's a lot calmer. Everyone has more time. So I'm in the Los Angeles Dodgers clubhouse in Glendale, Arizona, talking to Justin Turner, who used to play for the Mets, now is on the Dodgers, and is a major character in the book. And I've known him for quite a few years. And we're talking about the book, and he says, well, how long is the book? And I said, well, it's going to be, let's say 90,000 words, roughly. And he said, how long are your articles? I said, like 1,000. Yeah. And he said, well, just write 90 articles. How hard could that be? And I said, I thought that was the craziest advice I'd ever heard in my life. And I told him so at the time. But looking back on it, it actually was pretty good advice. That's kind of what it was like. I didn't really know what I was doing. And when I started working on the book, my goal was just to make sure I had enough to say. Because that's always your big fear, I think, when you're staring at the blank page is, will I be able to even write enough to fill a book? So I didn't, for a long time, didn't concern myself much with the structure of the book. It was just start writing. Just when I have good anecdotes, good stories, just start writing it. Eventually, I sort of narrowed it down to 4 main characters, 4 main coaches, gurus, each of whom had one sort of well-known success story. And I basically had 4 Google Docs for each one and wrote them all as long magazine profiles, as if I were going to write a magazine story individually. No thought yet of how does this all sort of mush together. But once I then sort of had that on the page, I now had 105,000 words sort of all separately. Then it became, all right, how do we massage this together? How do we sort of piece this here? What goes there? It was a little bit of a Frankenstein's monster mission where you're like snipping and cutting from different places and putting together.
And then it was just about writing sort of transitions that linked it all together. And I hope that when you read it, it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel like I was sort of stitching it together with glue and Scotch tape, but that's how it felt, that I was cutting and pasting and snipping, and all of a sudden I have a living, breathing monster here.
Yeah, yeah. And no, I think you made that work well. It's the whole is greater than its parts, I think, of the book, and I think that's generally what you want to accomplish with a book like this.
Yeah, and I didn't know at the beginning that I was going to be participating in it. You mentioned sort of the first person element. As a journalist, that is so foreign. You're so trained out of not injecting yourself into the story at all, and that was not my intention when I started. Even when I sold the project, even when we sold the proposal, that was not really part of it yet. It just sort of struck me that it was something that I could do. It was this incredible epiphany that's like, hey, I'm not bound by sort of the rules that you have in the Wall Street Journal. You could do something different. It doesn't have to just be what you would do for work. And that's what I realized. Hey, I have access to these incredible people. I have this media baseball game, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point. That's going to be happening while I'm working on this book. I should probably take advantage of that. And honestly, when I came to that realization and I added that element, I think it's really when it started to come together, because it gave it sort of a fun voice that I was wondering where I would find it. And I think that's where I found it when I realized, hey, I should write about myself in this too. Not the whole book, but throughout a little bit.
Yeah, because I think it helps people connect a little bit. It's not just about these, as you talk about them, these athletic beasts, these superstars, and then kind of their otherworldly abilities. It's, you also were trying to see if these techniques could help you. And I think also I'm curious just to know about your love of baseball in the first place, because all of this if you keep going back, right? Like you found this story, when you were working for the Journal, but you wanted to work for the Journal and cover baseball, but you were interested in working with the coaches because you like baseball. I feel like just to keep peeling away the onions, where does the love of baseball come from? When did that start for you?
So, goodness gracious, my birth announcement was a baseball card with my baby picture, my newborn picture, and the back of the card had my statistics, like my height and weight and whatever other statistics one would
you were preordained.
Attribute to a 2-day-old. It's really funny. My parents were recently cleaning out my old bedroom because my mom has been sort of working on Zoom from there because, working at home like everybody else. Yeah. And they uncovered a journal. It was for school. I guess my 3rd grade teacher made us all keep journals, and it had various poems and little writing assignments in it. And they showed this to me recently, just about a week or two ago. And apparently in the 3rd grade, I wrote in this journal that my dream of life was to get to try out for the Yankees. I don't remember writing this, but it does sound like something I would write. So I'm pretty sure it's true. Okay. So yes, I was preordained, but sometime not too long after 3rd grade, I think I realized that wasn't going to happen. I feel like third grade was probably the last year I thought maybe that was possible before you realize you're not really that good. Like you're okay, and it's really hard, and there's a lot of better players than you out there. But I knew this is what I wanted to do for really as long as I remember, even as early as 2nd, 3rd grade, I started a sports, primarily baseball newspaper that I typed up on my first, giant PC, Windows 95 computer.
Sure.
And my dad would then print them out in his office because we didn't have a printer at my house at the time. This is, the mid 90s. And I would then distribute them in my classmates' milk carton cubby mailboxes. That was my first writing professional gig, was that assignment. So yeah, I've been on this path for a while.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing. Okay. I like that. Well, then good for you for achieving that. That's pretty impressive. I feel like not everyone even gets to that far, even if they just want to write about a sport they love.
Yeah, I was really fortunate. I was really driven. That was very unusual. Most people didn't know what they wanted to do when they were 20, let alone 10. And I became sort of singularly focused and trying to make it happen, not really knowing what it actually took to do it. I knew nothing really until I got to college. I knew nothing about actually what sports journalism was, but I just knew I wanted to try to do it. And I've been very fortunate. You know, I've been at the Wall Street Journal now for over 9 years. It's the only job I've ever had. I've been covering baseball, which was my ultimate dream since 2013. 2020, if there is a baseball season, fingers crossed, it will be my 8th covering baseball for the Journal. So yeah, I could not ask for a better, at this moment, professional situation. I just hope baseball comes back, because it's killing me that there's no games right now as we sit here in May.
Right. We're all hoping for the sports to return safely. But okay, but let's turn to baseball now and think about it. You know, one of the things you do in the book is talk about sort of the history of baseball, and me as sort of a very casual fan didn't know a lot of this. So I think maybe kind of helping set the stage here before we turn to the majority of the book, just to start at the beginning of the game, really, in you know, the 19th and early 20th centuries. You know, baseball was very different than it is now, and things were different. The swing was different because of that. You know, how did the game start and begin to evolve over those first 50, 60 years?
Right. So anybody who's played Little League at any point is probably heard from their coach, you want to swing down or you want to swing level, hit the top of the ball, be short to the ball, all these sort of cues that, as my book sort of explains, we know maybe don't make a lot of sense in practice. So I was really curious about where that all started. Like, why did that become conventional wisdom? Because I certainly heard when I was growing up that you want to hit the ball on the ground, you want to be short to the ball, you want to swing level or down on it, which, like, where did that even come from? So it turns out there's a good reason for it, and it goes all the way back to the beginning of the game. You know, baseball, when it first started, was a completely different game. Like, yeah, the trappings were the same. Like, someone threw the ball, someone hit it, you would run, someone would try to catch it. That was the same on sort of the most broad general level. But how it was played sort of specifically couldn't be more different. First of all, there were no home runs, really. That wasn't like a thing that existed. There weren't fences, or if there were fences, they were 10 million feet away. They were just playing on like big open fields. The baseballs themselves were not made to sort of fly in the air. They were softer. They were totally different. Also, they didn't trade out the balls a million times during the game. So after a couple innings, the ball was just like a dented mess. Like, you couldn't hit the ball far. So what baseball was about in the early game was about sort of finesse. It was a much more strategic game. The idea was that you would try to guide the ball, almost like tennis. Someone would throw the ball, and instead of you just trying to hit it as far as you can, you were actually trying to place it where there were no defenders. And you could do that because pitchers didn't throw 100 miles an hour like they do now. They were basically just lobbing it in there. In fact, for much of baseball history, or early baseball history, the hitter was allowed to tell the pitcher where they wanted him to throw it. Specifically, they would point, I want it here, I want it there, high, low, inside, outside, because the goal of the pitcher wasn't to confuse the batter or throw it by the batter. The goal was just to throw it up to him for him to hit it. So it was an entirely different game. So in that paradigm, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You want to hit the ball on the ground. You want to try to guide the ball where there are no fielders. Balls in the air were easier to catch because all you do is catch on a fly. On a ground ball, you're like able to place it where there is nobody. Also, fielders didn't wear gloves at early part of baseball, or when they did start wearing gloves, they were very rudimentary gloves. So fielding was very hard. Catching a ball in the air a little bit easier, but fielding a ground ball and then throwing it to somebody else who then had to also catch it, it's like a multi-step process. Yeah. It was hard, which I did not know this, but if you look at the all-time leaders of errors in a season in Major League Baseball, they all are before like 1918. Everyone, the top like 25 seasons in errors are all like pre-1920. The whereas before 1920, more errors were made in those seasons than any other year. So there was great incentive to hit the ball on the ground, and it just stuck. Even as the game changed for many people, that philosophy sort of never went away. The way they taught hitters in 1915 kind of just, in a way, continued for 100 years because it's very hard to change something like baseball, which is this big institution. And there was sort of a lot of wars between guys like Ty Cobb, who really valued that old style of baseball, that sort of what he deemed to be aesthetically pleasing, versus, say, Babe Ruth, who came in the 20s and said, forget all that, I'm just going to try to hit the ball as far as I can. But that's sort of how this all started. And learning about the sort of the earliest part of baseball is so fascinating, because baseball fans love to think that baseball's never changed, that it's been the same for 100 years. But that's ridiculous. Of course that's not true. So learning about that was really interesting for me.
It seemed to be one of the kind of the big markers within that history was Ted Williams and this book that he published on hitting that, you talked to a lot of people who are still reading that book, and you talked about some of the discussions he got into with other players about what he thought was the correct way to do it. So talk a little bit about Ted Williams and that shift and change, and maybe any other characters kind of that era that started to at least dream of another way.
Ted Williams, of course, is in many people's minds the best hitter who ever lived. It's hard to argue that. I certainly wouldn't argue that. I never got to see him play, of course, but enough people say it that I tend to believe them. He wrote a book in 1970 called The Science of Hitting, which, sort of as an aside, stands sort of in counterpoint to Tony Gwynn's book, which is called The Art of Hitting, which came out about 35 years later. Sort of tells you how Ted Williams sort of viewed his craft. And in that book, it's a really interesting book. It's not very long. It's sort of a hitting manual, something that I'm certainly not qualified to write, where he talks about sort of the mechanics of the swing and how he approaches hitting. And in that book, the most interesting sort of long-lasting part of that book, he writes that you have probably heard, as I mentioned before, that the ideal swing was down or level. But in Ted Williams' mind, that was wrong. And in fact, the ideal swing was up, slightly up. He wrote on a 10-degree incline. I have absolutely no idea how he calculated that 10-degree incline. There was certainly nothing actually measuring it, but that's what he said. So we'll just go with it. 10-degree incline. That's what he wrote. And he said that was what he tried to do with every single swing, was to not hit the top of the ball, not the swing level, not the swing down, but to hit the bottom of the ball and try to hit the ball in the air every single time. And he had a lot of explanations of how he went about doing that and why he approached it that way. And it's all really fascinating. And at the time, most people kind of just ignored it, or at least sort of put it aside. The reason for that, there's a few reasons why, but the biggest one was it was totally radical. It went completely against what was being taught in the mainstream baseball world by other sort of hitting coaches. The sort of celebrity hitting coach of the day was a guy named Charlie Lau, which, if you were a baseball fan at that time, you probably know Charlie Lau. He was sort of he was the first sort of celebrity coach. He had books, he had VHS tapes, he was in TV shows and movies, and he was just sort of the hitting guru of the day. He was a major league hitting coach before major league hitting coaches was even sort of a widespread concept as a job. I mean, he taught the exact opposite: swing down, hit the ball on the ground, try to slap the ball around. Ted Williams vehemently disagreed with that, but what people said was, well, you're Ted Williams, you're a freak, you have 20/10 vision, you're totally crazy. No normal person can do what you do. We have to model ourselves after, more average hitters, which is totally crazy in hindsight. Because what other industry do you not just model yourself after the best, but rather model yourself after the average Joe? But that was what baseball did for a long time. But there were some people that realized that Ted Williams was on with something, and The Science of Hitting sort of became their Bible. They sort of were the underground, saying like, hey, we should listen to this guy. It's Ted Williams. And now here we are, 50 years later, remarkably, 2020, it's in 50 years. And now we have the benefit of technology and wearable devices and bat sensors and all this incredible stuff, and computer programs that literally could track, frame by frame, how great hitters' bats move through the hitting zone. And lo and behold, not saying everything Ted Williams said was exactly right, but generally speaking, we now know that, great hitters don't swing down, they swing up. Ted Williams was right all along, but it just took until we had sort of the technological wherewithal to prove it, which gets into another interesting sort of aside, which is great hitters often, what they say and what they do are different. or at
Right.
least they were. So many great hitters. If you watch Sunday Night Baseball on ESPN, not right now because there is no Sunday Night Baseball because there's no baseball, but normally pretend it's normal times. Alex Rodriguez is an announcer on Sunday Night Baseball. And he frequently talks about how he just tried to swing down. He tried to swing straight through the ball, be short to the ball, work back up the middle, hit the ball sort of on the top half. Well, anyone that's watched Alex Rodriguez's swing knows that's not what he does. He swings up. He tries to hit the ball in the air. But that mental cue of I try to be short to the ball, it works for him. So you never change him. What happened was so many great hitters just sort of were told that the ideal swing was to be short. So if they're having success, they're like seeing it in reverse. They're having success, so therefore that must be what they're doing. But in reality, they're not doing that at all. But we now know that definitively. But for a long time, we didn't. Great hitters would say, this is what I did. There was no real video or technology to disprove them until now. And it's part of why this revolution is finally happening, because these people that were saying, no, this is what it really is, are now have empirical evidence that they're right.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point you make over and over again. It's as soon as the technology came and someone thought of using it for that purpose, even. I mean, even we were able to record people. We had film cameras for long periods of time. It never really occurred to people to put it, and watch what a batter was doing at that level. So I think it's, you talk about in this book, these gurus started doing that and really being able to prove their point. And that was the big switch.
Video was actively frowned upon back then.
That's interesting.
Back in the 70s and 80s, especially when video cameras existed, great hitters would say things like, oh, I don't need that. Like, I know what I do. It was seen as like a sign of weakness almost, that you would need it was like cheating on, like just like studying for the test. Like it was somehow seen as like, well, if you're a really great hitter, you don't need that stuff. You just sort of know intuitively like what your body does. That was the attitude for a long time. Really until like the 90s. That was like a widespread attitude, was like, well, I'm a great hitter. I don't need that stuff. That's for lesser players.
Yeah, the hubris there. All right, so one of the first people you introduce us to is Craig Wallenbrock. So maybe just talk about him as one of these first gurus and where he came from and what his mindset was.
Craig Wallenbrock might be the single most fascinating human being I've ever met in any walk of life. He would have been a sort of radical revolutionary in any industry, I think, but baseball is very fortunate that that's what he chose. Craig Wallenbrock is in his mid-70s now. He grew up in Southern California, outside of LA in Pasadena, playing baseball. Was a good baseball player, on the street. It was a different time. There wasn't sort of the widespread organized travel ball we have now. It was just sort of playing with your friends, playing in your neighborhood. He had an opportunity to go play at San Diego State University in the 1960s, had a scholarship there. So moves down to San Diego. His first semester there, before he played a single game, he quits the baseball team, sort of has this crisis of faith in life. The Vietnam War sort of was raging on, and he became sort of very disillusioned with the world, like many young people back in the 60s. Was sort of like a hippie, And he ends up leaving the baseball team, says, I'm done with baseball, moves down to the beach and becomes a full-time surfer and just like he describes himself as a pot-smoking hippie and a full-time surfer for years. That's what Craig Wallenbrock did. He surfed and smoked and sort of lived at the beach, down Mission Beach, down or in La Jolla, sort of down there in Southern California. Years later, he sort of gets back into baseball. There's an interesting story as to why. It has to do with his brother, who was much younger than him, brings him back into sort of baseball. And he ends up, through another sort of weird twist of life, the way life takes you on these journeys, has an opportunity to throw batting practice to neighborhood players. There were a lot of major league players that came out of Southern California, obviously, and he knew a lot of them just from the neighborhood. And they would come back in the wintertime and want to stay in shape and keep on hitting. It wasn't like today where you have like very defined like regiment training protocols. It was just like, go hit at your high school field in the off season. They all knew Craig and he had a good arm. And they're like, will you throw us batting practice? So Craig Wallenbrock said, okay, well, he's also working with his brother, trying to help his brother. So he buys an old video camera like we were talking about before. And he asked them, hey, do you mind if I film you? And I would like to just sort of study it. And they say, all right, whatever. So he films their swings and he starts sort of making observations, like what they have in common, the great hitters. These are major league hitters. Like, what are they doing? And it went very much against what he had always been taught, even like in high school, what he thought he did. And he started sort of taking notes and learning things. And he started sort of imparting what he was observing to his brother. And he would go back to the hitters like we were talking about before and say, like, hey, why do you do this? Why are you doing this with your elbow? Why are you doing this with your shoulder? And they would say, that's not what I do. And he would say, well, it's right here on the tape. They would say, I don't need the tape. So he said to himself, all right, we're done actually talking to these guys. We're just going to film them, and we're just going to observe them and teach what we see, not what they think they're doing. And it led him down this incredible path. And he's a real interesting guy. He started weaving in all this other sort of cross-disciplinary stuff that he's interested in. You talk to Craig Wallenbrock about hitting, and he'll talk about samurais and landscape painters from China in the 16th century, and how big cats stalk their prey in the jungle, and folk music, and all this crazy stuff. And somehow it all relates to the swing, but that's how his mind works. And he sort of became a crazy hitting guru who had the opportunity over the years to work with some pretty incredible hitters, mostly in secret, until recently. When he sort of burst onto the scene, when J.D. Martinez, who anyone who follows baseball knows J.D. Martinez, sort of let the cat out of the bag, which is, hey, I worked with this guy and he taught me how to hit. And suddenly Craig Wallenbrock became a celebrity in the baseball world. Yeah. And now, all these years later, he is now working for the Los Angeles Dodgers as sort of their hitting savant. It took until his, in his 70s for him to get the recognition that he deserved. And I think his story, I think, is sort of the primary narrative of the book. I think it might be the most interesting of everything in the book, his story and how everyone sort of branches off of Craig.
Yeah, totally. And so mentioning J.D. Martinez, maybe just quickly fill us in. I mean, what was that story? What was the relationship like? What did J.D. have to do?
So J.D. Martinez was with the Houston Astros for a few years, and he wasn't very good. He was struggling. He was great in the minor leagues. He was great in college. But he gets to the Astros. This is in 2013, 2014, it's actually before that. It was like 2011, 12, around then. And he was struggling.
Okay.
He was just wasn't making it. He was doing all right. He was in the major leagues. He wasn't having any sort of success, sort of meaningful success. And sort of he realized through some, I don't want to spoil too much, but through a really incredible way, sort of realizes that what I'm doing is not working. And the problem is not that the pitching is better. And the problem is not that, the coaches don't support me. Like any player who struggles, they have these sort of excuses like, oh, well, the coach doesn't like me, or I'm just struggling right now, or whatever. They always rationalize it. We finally had this realization that, hey, no, the problem is me. What I'm doing is not working. And I get why that's a hard realization to me, because what he was doing had worked for his whole life. And not just worked, it got him all the way to the major leagues. He was an incredible hitter for his whole life. Suddenly, he realizes this is no longer good enough. I need to make a change. And he connects with Craig Wallenbrock through a teammate with the Astros who had also worked with Craig Wallenbrock and had a big breakout in 2013. In between 2013 and 2014, J.D. Martinez went to Southern California, where Craig Wallenbrock has his little warehouse/laboratory, and says, I'm in your hands. I will do whatever you say. I am ready to be remolded like a lump of clay. And Craig Wallenbrock says, all right, let's go to work. They spent the whole offseason remaking J.D. Martinez's swing from scratch. Craig Wallenbrock told him, what you are doing needs to be completely remade. The teammate that referred you to me, that was just a tweak. We just did some tinkering. He was already in pretty good shape, but you're not. We need to just start again. And JD, to his credit, many major league hitters would have said no. He said, okay. He was that desperate at that point. He realized that he was sort of reaching the end of the road. remakes the swing from scratch, comes back to spring training in 2014 with the Astros. The Astros, in all their infinite wisdom, cut him. They said, we've seen enough of you. You are not good enough. You're not going to make it. JD Martinez said, hey, no, I'm different. Like, give me a chance. They said, basically, too bad. They cut him. Well, that was their loss because the Detroit Tigers signed him very quickly after that to a minor league contract. This was in spring training. He shows up on the first day after the Tigers signed him. He's playing a minor league game against the Astros on the backfields in Florida at spring training. He had 3 home runs. With the Astros GM who had just cut him watching, that GM, Jeff Luhnow, we could talk about Jeff Luhnow for hours, considering what's happened with the Astros since this all
Seriously.
went down. He realized very quickly he made a mistake. JD Martinez in 2014 was a star for the Tigers, and he's only gotten better since. He's now one of the best hitters in the major leagues, and it happened really because he was willing to remake his swing from absolute scratch with Craig Wallenbrock, and it's a truly remarkable story, and now he's not the only one.
Yeah, and at that point you made, he was willing to do it. He said, whatever it takes, I'm yours. And, there are definitely, like you said, some players that wouldn't have agreed to that, or that their pride, held up their ability here to be coached. So, did you get a sense of what makes someone coachable? What is it that makes someone, because you profiled players that were in their late 30s, very late in their career, or at the beginning of their career, do they need help? Is there something special about these players that allows them to be coachable? And what can we do with players that aren't, or what can we do with, even people that aren't? Because I feel like there's some parallels here to being able to grow and change yourself as well.
Enormously. There was a really good article written, I think it was like late 2018, maybe it was even in 2019, by Lars Anderson for the Athletic. He was a former major league player. He was not a very successful one. He was sort of an up and down kind of guy. And he wrote a really good story about his experience with Craig Wallenbrock, how he went to go see him and it did not work for him. And he realized later the reason it didn't work for him is because he never actually trusted it. In the back of his mind the whole time, he was thinking, like, this is not going to work, or I'm not really willing to make these changes, or why do I trust this guy, or well, do I really feel comfortable making the wholesale change that this guy wants me to make? And it failed, and he didn't have success. He ended up not really having a successful career. And he wrote about how he realized that maybe if he had just trusted Craig at the time, or somebody else, that he would have been better. So that is often how players think. They have pride. It's not just players, like you said, it's all walks of life. Yeah. It's really hard to be told, like, what you're doing is wrong. You have to do something different. The common thread that I've heard, is from these players is that they reached a point of desperation. And that's really powerful. Desperation is remarkably powerful, where all of a sudden you come to the realization that, like, it's either this or my life is over. Like, for this is their livelihood. They don't make money if they don't make it. They saw sort of their own baseball mortality, and therefore their life mortality in some ways, because they had never done anything else. They didn't know what their lives were like without baseball. And that's really tough because there is pride involved. And to make it to the major leagues, just to get even close, you need to be so incredibly arrogant. You don't make it to the major leagues without thinking you are the man. There's no way you can. There's too much competition. You need to have an ego to make it. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Like, if I want that in the major league, I want, when you step on a major league field, you have to think you are the greatest players ever lived, because otherwise you're not going to get that far. So to put that aside and say, this isn't working, desperation, I think, is the emotion that, I don't know if desperation is an emotion, but the feeling that motivated them. And I think that's the case with anybody. And I think, honestly, we're seeing that now. There's a lot of desperate people in the world right now. And sometimes it causes you to make really dumb decisions when you're desperate, but other times it could give you real clarity. And I think in the case of the people I wrote about, it was the latter.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I want to just quickly check in on some of the other gurus here, because, like you said, they're all kind of interesting, fascinating people. Richard Schenck was another one, if I pronounced that right. This guy was just fascinating to me, his story and his personality, the duality of his personality. Maybe what was Richard Schenk's story, and how did he end up getting to connect with some of these major league players?
Oh goodness, Richard Schenk, difficult person to write about. Probably the biggest challenge in the book was figuring out how to deal with Richard Schenk. So Richard Schenk, he worked with Aaron Judge, the great Yankee slugger, in between 2016 and 2017. Aaron Judge came up in 2016 with the Yankees and he struggled. He struck out a ton. He was really bad. Comes back in 2017 and hit like 52 home runs or something. He was like unbelievable. And according to Aaron Judge, he did that in part by remaking a swing with Richard Schenk. Well, who is Richard Schenk? Richard Schenk owns a pool hall in Missouri outside of St. Louis. He played low-level college baseball, not a good hitter. He's in his 50s, like a middle-aged guy. Does not seem very impressive to look at. Doesn't look athletic by any stretch of the imagination. So how did this guy end up working with Aaron Judge? Well, Richard Schenk was essentially, before he was the hitting coach for Aaron Judge, was essentially a professional internet troll. I'm not sure there's a better way to put it. He would be scouring the internet, the pre-social media. What it was like internet forums where people would talk about hitting. It was mostly just dads that were trying to like help their kids get better. And it was really crazy. And there was a lot of yelling and screaming arguments and a lot of interesting sort of high level conversation as well, with people saying like, I think this is right, this is wrong, this conventional wisdom is totally wrong, we really should be doing this. And it was pretty brutal. It was just really, it was like a war. These people would just destroy each other. And Richard Schenk was a very controversial figure on this. What he did was sort of devote himself to Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds is the best hitter in the world, of course, in the mid 2000s. Richard Schenk decided, you know what, all these people on the internet, they don't know what they're talking about, they're all wrong. I am just going to sit in my basement every single night, and I am going to watch Barry Bonds, and then I am going to film myself, and I am going to do this every single night for hours until my swing and Barry Bonds' swing look the same. It's kind of nuts. But Richard Schenk discovered some interesting things, or at least he thought they were interesting, and it led to him sort of teaching the swing in a way that nobody else teaches. It is crazy, so different than everybody else. It goes completely against not just conventional wisdom, it goes against like physics. It's completely different than anyone has ever taught hitting ever in any other area in history of baseball. Well, some people sort of thought, well, maybe this guy's onto something. He kind of had like a faction of people that believed in him. And Richard Schenk was pretty nasty if you didn't side with him. He would go after you, he would attack your children, your videos of your kids, you just call them wrong and stupid and be really nasty about them. And that is still the case now on Twitter, where he is a professional Twitter troll, talking about the swing in very convoluted ways. But some people really believed in it. One of them was a guy named David Matranga, who was a brief major league player, but basically a career minor league player, who said, this guy's kind of onto something. You know, he might be a little rough around the edges, but he's saying something interesting. Well, David Matranga eventually became an agent, a player agent. Aaron Judge became one of his clients. After 2016, David Matranga went to Aaron Judge and said, hey, I have this guy. He's pretty weird. He's going to teach things about hitting that make no sense to you, but I think he could help you out. Do me a favor and give me 5 days. Give him 5 days. Come to Arizona for a 5-day crash course. If you think it's crazy, you can completely ignore it, but what do you have to lose? So Aaron Judge, being a young, sort of nice, polite individual, says, okay, goes out to Arizona in between 2016 and 2017. Immediately is subjected to Richard Schenk's very unusual sort of ways of teaching the swing. Well, guess what? It worked. At least for Aaron Judge it did, because he came back in 2017 and was like the best hitter in the major leagues. But Richard Schenk's very controversial, not just because of what he teaches, but the way he conducts himself. You could follow him on Twitter, TeacherMan1986. He is loud. He is aggressive. He could be very combative. Like I said, professional internet troll. But he has people like Aaron Judge and others that believe in it. So how do you reconcile that? It was the hardest part of writing the book, was trying to figure out how to handle this renegade. Yeah.
I mean, it generally across all these different characters, all these personalities, they're all kind of outside the system. And one thing that you talk about over and over again in the book is how the players had to try and deal with this themselves when they learned something from these radical coaches, then they had to go back to their teams and try and implement it actually in the game. You know, the team's hitting coaches are kind of looking at them like, what are you doing? Like, this is how you do it. Listen to me. And they might be like, well, I learned differently from someone else. And that was kind of dichotomy. That was like pulling at them a lot. And they're kind of getting tugged at both sides. You know, how do the players manage that? And why was baseball so resistant for so long to this kind of change?
Outsiders were not looked at very kindly in baseball for most of baseball history. It's a very insular, hidebound sort of industry. And one sort of tenet of most of baseball history was that in order to sort of understand Major League Baseball, you had to have played Major League Baseball. And if you didn't, you're not in the club. If you played big league baseball, you're in that club. If you're not, you're not, and you're on the outside. And that was really hard for baseball to deal with. Now, it started with Moneyball. Let's not ever forget about Moneyball, maybe the greatest baseball book ever written. What was Moneyball about? Well, it was about a lot of things. But one thing it was about was outsiders coming into baseball in front offices and how they changed the game. Now, they weren't players, they weren't coaches, they were executives. That was sort of the foray, the entry-level foray into outsiders sort of infiltrating the game. And there was a real fight. Well, now those outsiders who are not outsiders at all anymore, because every team now has that style of front office, they said, well, you know what? We were outsiders. Maybe there's other outsiders in other areas of the game that might also have insight that these sort of lifelong baseball people don't have. And that's why we've seen this change in recent years, where so many of these one-time outsiders, guys who didn't play themselves, at least at a high level, are now being given the opportunity to be coaches in Major League Baseball or minor league baseball, which was complete sacrilege even 5 years ago. The idea of someone that didn't play pro ball getting to coach in pro ball, well, now it's becoming common. And it started with guys who were once outsiders themselves, and not just guys, now women. We're seeing women coaches as well. That's sort of the next frontiers. Women coaches in professional baseball, which was even 2 years ago was not a thing, and now is slowly but surely becoming it. And it's because of people that said there's probably a better way. And you know why I know that? Because I was a better way once upon 15, 20 years ago. So why would that same logic not apply to other areas? And that's not to say that experience doesn't matter or that having played in Major League Baseball isn't very valuable. It's about balance. It's a mix. Experience is valuable. Technology is valuable. Being sort of a computer whiz kid is valuable. And how do we sort of combine all of this to change what a baseball coaching staff looks like? Yeah,
totally. And we've talked obviously exclusively about hitting up to this point. And you talked about how last season, most home runs ever. So, what about the pitchers? I'm sure they're trying their best here to stop all that. Is it just that the hitters are always going to win this battle? What weapons do the pitchers have, and how has pitching been changing to respond to all this?
Well, hitters will never win the battle. Baseball history is essentially it's a pendulum that stays on one side always, but it just sometimes goes farther to that side. If you could imagine. Pitching's always ahead of hitting. It always will be. Now, there are times in baseball history where pitching gets so far ahead of hitting that the game just becomes ridiculous. One time, the most famous time of that would be 1968, the year of the pitcher. The very next year, 1969, baseball actually had to step in and say, this is absurd. The pitching is too good. We have to change the height of the mound to give hitters a chance. And we saw another sort of year of the pitcher in 2014, right before all of this started. And hitters said, we have to do something different here. And they slowly but surely started changing their swings, or at least some of them having success. Well, pitchers are finding ways to combat this, of course. You're seeing a lot more like high fastballs. Some people would say that the swing up mentality or approach started because in the 90s, really, the style of pitching was everything down. It was all sinker balls and sliders. So the way you deal with pitches that were like down is to swing up to try to elevate them, sort of golf them. So now you're seeing more fastballs up around players' letters because it's hard to swing with an uppercut if the pitch is already high. It's worked to some extent, but for some of the guys who really mastered this new swing, it hasn't mattered at all. But look, pitchers always have the advantage. in some way. They throw harder now than ever. There's things with technology where they're able to design new pitches that never existed before and spin the ball in ways that like defy the laws of physics. So it's always a battle of hitters just trying to catch up enough. Right now, we're in a moment where hitters are like just kind of like not embarrassing themselves. But I'm sure 3 or 4 years from now or whenever, pitchers will take that next leap forward and will find the next station for hitting to try to catch up again.
Yeah. I want to come back to, because I know this, we talked about earlier about how you were able to personally inject yourself here. So talk a little about the journalist game and the instruction you got from these gurus and what that was like working with them firsthand.
One of the great traditions in the New York media is an annual baseball game. 2 annual baseball games, actually, between the New York Baseball Writing Corps and the Boston Media Corps. 1 game at Yankee Stadium and 1 game at Fenway Park. It's an unbelievable thing to be able to play at these incredible stadiums. It's remarkable. It's so much fun. Well, I thought to myself, I'm never really that good in these games. Maybe I could be better. And I've accessed these incredible hitting gurus. So I said, hey guys, would you mind helping me out? I have this game coming up in a few months. Could we work on my swing? And fortunately, they were nice, and maybe they took pity on me and gave me that shot. So I had a chance to get in the cage with 3 or 4 different hitting guru experts types. And throughout the book, I wrote about my own experiences and how it affected my performance in the game. Don't want to spoil it because it's a sort of the grand finale of the book. But that was what. For me personally, that was the most fun part of doing it. Like getting to get back in the batting cage the first time since I was a kid and, take some cuts.
Yeah, I can imagine. As you get to the end of the book, you start to kind of ruminate on baseball's future a little bit. I mean, the game is obviously changing a lot. Games are getting very long. Even just thinking about now when baseball comes back, are people going to sit through very long games anymore? What are some of the changes you think might start happening, or how do you see the game kind of evolving, both in response to, the Swing Kings that you've talked about, but also just in general, the shutdown and everything?
Well, right now I just miss baseball. I think people miss baseball so much right now that people would gladly take a 4-hour baseball game.
Right, take
right
anything.
Now.
Yeah.
But look, baseball as an industry has some legitimate problems. The games are really long. They are slow. The demographics are problematic. The audience is too old, essentially. Younger people don't seem to love baseball the way they did before. So these are all legitimate problems, and baseball is trying to come up with various plans to make the game more appealing to young people. And I agree with some of them. I do think that the games are too long. I do think they are sort of too slow. There is a way to speed up the game. But what I always say when people sort of ask me about the future of baseball is, and this is true, throughout the history of baseball, going back to legitimately 1910, 1900, there have been articles in newspapers written about how baseball was dying, that this generation of baseball just doesn't understand the game, that the players don't understand the history, and that baseball is not going to survive another generation. And here we are in 2020, and baseball is still doing just fine. In fact, it's an $11 billion industry. So does baseball have legitimate problems? Yeah, no question about it. They need to be worked out. Do I believe that assuming Earth exists in 100 years, baseball will too? Yeah, I do. And I still think it'll be popular. Will it be different? Probably, but it will still be there because baseball has this way of enduring somehow, and I just believe it will, because people always think it's dying, and then it somehow never dies.
There you go. Words of comfort, baseball fans. It'll all work out. All right. Well, just to kind of wrap it up, is there anything else in the book that we didn't talk about, or any other like big concepts or ideas or stories or anything that you really wanted to be sure people got out of it?
Not about the content of the book, but sort of about books in general right now. Obviously, when I sold this book, when I started working on it, I did not anticipate releasing it into this environment, as I'm sure we could all imagine. It came out on March 31st, which was supposed to coincide with opening day, like the first couple of days of the baseball season. And of course, it didn't quite go the way we expected. But I do hope that for people who miss baseball immensely, it's sort of a taste of the game we're missing. And I do appreciate sort of everyone that's is in the position to still buy a book in these trying times, because, it means a lot to me. This is such an important project for me in my life, and it was my baby for 2 years, and it was really tough to know that it was going to be put out into this world. So I hope that people are still able to find it, and it finds that audience.
Yeah, I think that's so important, that people support books like this. And I think you do a good job of bringing your passion into the book and getting that excitement there. So it is a good opportunity for people to really read about a sport and even get connected to it and learn more. But I learned so much about baseball that I just had no idea about, that it's a great way to connect to the sport while you're kind of waiting. So I think you did good there. What else are you up to right now? I mean, are you working on other stuff? Are you writing for the journal in other areas?
I'm still writing about sports and still writing about baseball.
About sports.
It's been busy. People keep asking that, like, what do you write about when there's no sports when you're a sports writer? Well, I'm still writing about sports because there's so many fascinating angles to be covered when this giant industry shuts down. It's unprecedented. So there's a lot to write about. And when it starts to ramp back up, that will sort of lead to a whole new angle, whole bunch of more stories of how does this giant thing start up again?
Right. Are they going to combine, the leagues and keep travel local? How are they going to, figure out how the season's going to play? Yeah.
No one knows yet. There's a bunch of theories. There's a million ideas. They've tossed around 1,000 ideas. How it will go, I don't know. I think we should have more clarity by the end of May. I think, well, at least one way or the other, I think we'll know something. Their goal, their dream goal is to start in early July. You could imagine why. Oh, Major League Baseball is back on July 4th.
Sure.
The commercial, the marketing around that will be a bit sickening if that actually is what happens. Well, maybe some people will like it. I find I don't really like that stuff. It's a little cloying for me, but some people might like it. But that's sort of the goal, I think, is early July. But they have no clue if that could happen. Like when people say, "Oh, they want to start in early July," that's what we want to do. Will they be able to do it? I don't know, but I think in 3 or 4 weeks from now, we'll have a better sense of what's possible. So we'll see.
All right, stay tuned, baseball fans. All right, let's wrap it up with a quick thunder round. We'll call it a day. So to start off, what is your favorite food and/or drink?
Oh my God, my favorite. What does it say with food? We're not talking about drinks. My favorite food.
Okay.
Well, I don't really know my old. Okay, this is a weird one, but we're gonna say that my favorite food, at least right now, are bagels, and the reason for that is my spouse, my wife, who's behind me right now, recently is on a gluten-free diet, so I've not really been able to eat any bagels, but I've been home for the last 2 months cooking everything, so I'm not gonna bring contraband into the home, so I'm craving a bagel, and I'll have to eat one when she's not around, which might not be for a year because we're not allowed to go outside, so we'll see.
right yeah, it's interesting the things that you miss, for sure. New York bagels are good. Where is your favorite place you've ever been?
Oh, for me, that's an easy one. That's an easier question for me.
Okay.
It's Martha's Vineyard. I go to Martha's Vineyard every single August since I was in utero. And there's no place in the whole world I like more. I've been, to really awesome trips and other countries, and they're amazing. And I love traveling the world, and I want to go see the whole world. But from a sort of emotional standpoint, Martha's Vineyard is my favorite place on the entire planet. I am still in my mind holding on to the idea that I will be there again this August, even though I have absolutely no idea if that's actually going to be possible.
Yeah, seriously. We're all holding on to when we can get back to our favorite places. All right, last question. If you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why? I get a sense of there's one easy answer to this question.
There is. It's that this would all be over and baseball would be back and I'd be able to get back to ballparks. Yeah. That honestly is what it is. I mean, the very, very macro level things of solve world hunger and world peace. Yeah, all that is great. And, that just doesn't seem very realistic. But if I could say the pandemic is over and baseball is back and we're all back out there and I'm at a ballpark tomorrow night, yeah, nothing would make me happier right now.
Well, may your wish come true. And let's wrap it up on that hopeful note. Thanks so much, Jared. This was great. Jared Diamond, author of Swing Kings. If you haven't been able to tell already, it's a great book about baseball, the game, the swing. Go check it out while you're missing baseball. Jared, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.